innocence and experience. She was a quiet little girl, never speaking unless spoken to. That was expected of her. Her family was very old world in their values, which is to say, they felt that little girls existed to grow up and become wives, and those wives were similarly expected to grow large and become mothers. A little girl wasn't much of anything else but more babies waiting to be. Violetta didn't like that idea. That was her name, Little Violet. And she was expected to take after her namesake, sweet and silent and shy. She never told her family how she really felt. Her family wouldn't have cared anyway. They were always too busy with the work. The menfolk went out and dug in the cemeteries, while the women stayed home, raising the little ones. Violetta didn't like the other children. They couldn't see the things that she could see. Instead of having tea parties with her cousins, Violetta liked talking to her special friends. Her aunties and her mother and all the little cousins couldn't see her friends. But then, no one would have expected Violetta to see them either. Her friends were part of the work, after all, and seeing them was something that only the menfolk in the family were supposed to do. That's what they all thought, anyway. They would have known differently had they ever bothered to talk to Violetta, but they never did. After all, she was only a girl. So Violetta spent all her time whispering to her friends. Her friends were all dead, but she didn't mind. They were very good listeners. And none of them cared that she was a girl. They didn't even care that she came from that family, the one so many others shunned in the marketplace. No, her friends were understanding, attentive, and kind. Each night they gathered round in a glimmering host. They laughed with her, and they told her things. Secret things. They talked about Daddy's work, digging up the corpses and polishing the bones. They talked about Grandfather and his friends, who used the bones to call and sometimes bind the spirits of the dead. Her friends didn't like the bindings, but they told Violetta how it was done. They loved her, and they trusted her, because she hated the men in her family as much as they did. Each night, Violetta listened and grew cunning in the ways of the spirits. And the menfolk in her family were none the wiser. As Violetta grew from a quiet little girl to a quiet young lady, the men in the family started to pay attention to her. Most of it was the wrong kind of attention. Her uncle Pietro was the worst of the lot. He liked Violetta perhaps a bit too much. Violetta was 12 years old. When Pietro came to her in the night, she endured it. She didn't know what else to do. Pietro was so very strong, and he promised not to make it hurt if she kept still just long enough to let him do it. Daddy was away in the cemetery. Of course, he wouldn't have stopped it. She knew he didn't care. But Violetta's friends were furious. They ranted and raged from their shadowy side of the world. When Pietro was gone, Violetta sat in a corner, silently weeping. Her friends tried to soothe her from their side of the world. They told her to be strong, and they promised vengeance for what Pietro did. Pietro wasn't like the other men in the family. He didn't know the names or the words to call. He might see spirits out of the corner of his eye, but he had no talent for talking with them. This was why he was often left at home. He worked as a lowly guard for the family, but Violetta's friends told her this was a good thing. It meant that he could not defend himself. If they struck out at him, he would not be able to strike back. They promised to get him back for what he did to Violetta. They told her they were going to do it when Pietro was asleep, so there wouldn't be anyone else around. Violetta wasn't certain at first about their plan, but her spirit friends were insistent. Eventually she overcame her fear. She wanted to see him get hurt. She was still afraid, so she crept to the kitchen and pulled a knife from the drawer. She told herself it was just in case Pietro woke up and tried to do the thing again. The knife might keep him away. When the spirits descended upon him, he woke up all right. But he wasn't worried about Violetta. He didn't even see her there at first, standing quietly in a corner of the room. She held the knife tucked away in the folds of her dressing gown. Pietro was shouting wildly at the spirits as they shook his bed and struck him from across the veil. Welts and scratches appeared on his face and on his hands. The spirits called him mean things that he couldn't hear, but he could certainly feel the blows. By the time he noticed little Violetta in her dressing gown, she had already raised the knife. The spirits held him pinned to the bed as she moved. Then she used the knife, pushing it into him again and again. As the spirits held him, she said the words and recited the names, and before she knew it, Uncle Pietro was screaming from the inside of the blade. His spirit was bound to it, even as his body lay in a bloody heap on the bed. Then little Violetta cleaned herself up and spent the rest of the night playing with Uncle Pietro and all her dear dead friends.